Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, March 14th, 2023, and I'd like to call the Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers, State of Tennessee meeting to order. And Ms. Bohannon, if you'll call the roll, please.
Fred Berry. Anthony Harris.
Here.
Tanya Skell-Haynes.
Here.
Chris Lee.
Here.
Scotty Porsche. Charles Rahm. Pam Stevens. Mr. President, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Bohannon. At this time, you do have the agenda before you, and we'll review and take a motion to accept.
Motion to accept the order. This is Pam.
Second.
I have a motion by Ms. Stevens, a second by Mr. Lee. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right. You also have the February 14th, 2023 minutes before you. I'll give you a moment to review. If there needs to be any additions, deletions, we'll talk about those. If not, we'll move with a motion.
Motion to approve.
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Mr. Lee, a second by Ms. Haynes. Any further questions? If not, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. The next is our adoption of Robert's Rules of Order. For this board, the rules contained in the most recent version of Robert's Rules of Order shall govern the board in all cases to which they are applicable and which they are not inconsistent with statutes and any special rules of order the board may adopt. So we do need a motion to accept that for this board.
So moved.
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Mr. Lee, a second by Ms. Stevens. Any questions on this? If not, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. All right, Mr. Bryant, we're going to turn to you for our legal report, please.
All right. Good morning, board members. First, we have complaint numbers 2023-003301 and 2023-003321. This complaint was administratively opened following respondent's application for an apprentice funeral director and apprentice embalmer registration. Respondent had previously held an apprentice funeral director and embalmer registrations. However, these registrations were suspended in 2013. Specifically, respondent's registrations were suspended for, quote, delinquent or defaulted on a state or federal education loan or service conditional scholarship, end quote. However, when respondent reapplied for these registrations in 2023, in response to the question, quote, have you ever had a license or applied for a license or its equivalent to practice any profession or occupation that was denied, suspended, or revoked or otherwise acted against, end quote. Respondent replied, no. Respondent replied stating that they had marked no because they did not realize that the apprentice registrations were considered licenses for purposes of the application. Based on the above, we would recommend a letter of warning.
Quick question here. I know in the past on license expirations, we've done a $250 fine consistent. Is there a reason maybe why we're not doing that here?
I guess this one is less of a license expiration where they were continuing to practice and more of a 10 years ago, their registrations were revoked, and when coming back and answering the question to reapply for that registration, they provided misinformation. And from their response, it appears that was not intentional, that it was a misunderstanding. But the distinction between that and what we usually do on those is that this is less of a license expiration, and then you're doing unlicensed practice.
You're saying they had not practiced during this time, is that right?
To my knowledge, that's correct.
Move for approval. Legal's recommendation. Second.
All right, we have a a motion by Ms. Stevens, a second by Mrs. Haynes to accept legal's recommendation letter of warning. Any further questions? If not, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, number 2.
Next complaint is complaint number 2023-002611. This complaint was administratively opened following an inspection conducted on January 5th, 2023. Specifically, the respondent's establishment license expired on November 30th, 2022, and was not renewed at the time of the inspection. During the time of the expired establishment license, no funeral or cremation services were conducted. However, the establishment was open for business. Respondent replied stating that due to financial difficulty and slow business, they were unable to renew their license until January. Respondent stated that they were now up to date on their license. And based on the above, we would recommend a letter of warning.
So no calls were performed during this period.
Correct, from what the investigator observed.
But just to stay consistent, you feel like a letter of warning here, even though they were open for business?
I think here, and I acknowledge I struggled on this one, whether a letter of warning or a $250 civil penalty. What I think here distinguishes a little bit is that there were no services provided during that little over a month period of expired licensure, and the respondent does not have any disciplinary history. Those two things combined, and personally we recommend a letter of warning, but also if the board feels the $250 civil penalty is more appropriate, then I think there are certainly grounds for that as well.
So during that time frame, they probably answered phone calls or had people come in, or there was some sort of activity, you would think, with a business that is a funeral establishment.
It is certainly possible. I would say potentially even likely. We don't know that for certain, since that's something the inspector couldn't necessarily track or didn't track, to my knowledge. So that is certainly a possibility. As far as conducting services or conducting business, the investigator stated that there were records to show that didn't happen during that time period. But I think your point is certainly well taken, that calls could have been answered, consultations could have been held, things of that nature. We just don't know for certain.
Any other questions for legal?
I'll make a motion we accept legal's recommendation, letter of warning.
A second.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Lee, a second by Ms. Haynes to accept legal's recommendation, letter of warning. Any further questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, number 3.
Next complaint is complaint number 2023-002981. This complaint was administratively opened while conducting routine inspections on January 19th, 2023. The investigator observed a hearse parked in front of a vacant building advertising the respondent establishment. However, the address stated on the hearse was not the address at which the vacant building was located. The investigator went to the front door, which was locked with all the glass covered by paper. The investigator knocked on the door and no one answered. The investigator then walked to the restaurant next to the building and asked the server if they knew anything about the vacant building. The server stated that the people who leased the building were putting in a funeral home and handed the investigator a brochure from a stack placed on the counter. The investigator also observed a stack of business cards next to the stack of brochures. The investigator stated that inside the brochure were photographs of caskets, additional information, and prices. The back of the brochure listed 2 locations, one in Mississippi and the other the vacant building the investigator had checked. The investigator confirmed with the board's office manager and via CORE that the respondent establishment was not licensed, and at that time, the board had not received a new establishment application from respondent. Respondent replied, stating that they are in the process of remodeling the vacant building for a funeral home, and maintained that they had not had any services while operating as a Tennessee funeral home in any location. Regarding the brochures, respondent stated that they were left by mistake by a now former employee. Respondent contended that the former employee gave the brochures and cards to the restaurant, and that circulating the promotional materials was not approved or authorized by management or owners of the respondent establishment. Respondent added that management and owners were not even aware that the brochures and business cards had been placed at the restaurant, and provided that it had been stressed in all meetings that no promotional materials be circulated until they were licensed in Tennessee. Regarding the hearse, respondent stated that it had been parked in front of the building to receive a quote to have it repainted. Respondent explained that the wordage on the hearse included an old location because they had a previous deal for a building that had fallen through, and added that they had labeled the hearse to see how it would look from a design perspective, to decide if they wanted a different font, layout, etc. Respondent stated that they took full responsibility for failing to follow up with the employees, that no advertising materials be dispersed, and respondent again reiterated that they were unaware that the brochures and cards had been given to the restaurant. Finally, the respondent stated that they had been working with the city to obtain appropriate paperwork to submit to the board for a licensure application. Based on the above, we would recommend a $250 civil penalty, authorized via consent order, and a formal hearing if necessary.
Just reading this, it was my curiosity. Do you know what was on the hearse? Was it like a hearse that you park somewhere and advertise a funeral home? They were talking about the font and all. I was just...
I believe so. I think it was, well, I can't say that for certain. I was going to say, I think that it was a hearse to be intended for future use. But at this time, what they're purporting is that they wanted to have the hearse repainted, and so they just kind of left it there to get a quote on being repainted. But on the hearse, I'm not sure if, I would assume on the body of the vehicle, it had just the name of the future funeral home. Let's see. It included in that, it had the name of, I guess, not the location that they were in.
Where they were, or
right,
an older location.
Where they were planning, and then that deal fell through. But it had kind of promotional material on the hearse.
Has anyone spoken with the former employee about the materials that is discussed here?
No. This one wasn't sent for investigation because it was kind of an odd, it came up in a weird way. The investigator was, I think, out and about on their ordinary inspections, saw this, caught their eye, and just followed up with it. Go ahead, sorry.
That's what I was going to say. Had the inspector not ran across it, the hearse would probably still be parked there advertising. Am I correct?
Most likely. If what they're purporting is true, that it was there just to get a quote for being repainted, I guess it could have been moved by now. It's hard to say, but yeah.
Last question for me. I noticed this was on the 19th of January, and we're kind of pushing 2 months. Have they approached the board yet for licensure or anything?
Some paperwork, but they haven't paid any application fees, is my understanding.
Okay, the hearse and the font and all that sounds a little, I don't know, not a typical excuse. And I don't know of many hearses that have the name of their funeral home on the hearse. There's usually just a window, metal piece that goes into the window to advertise the funeral home name. That in itself does not require a lot of deciding on font. And I have a real concern that the funeral home name that had expired still had that funeral home name in the hearse. So it sounds a little like they're blaming the former employee. And not wanting to take responsibility.
And I guess just for clarity, and I may have misunderstood, and if I did, I apologize. So this isn't one that was licensed and then expired. This is one that, from my understanding, they are licensed in Mississippi and have a location there, are expanding into Tennessee, and kind of maybe in terms of finding a location, putting out a hearse, whether accidental or intentional promotional materials maybe put the cart before the horse a little bit before being licensed in Tennessee. So they're looking to branch into Tennessee for the first time. Application pending, as Mr. Gribble said. We've received some paperwork, but not everything. So this is not a case of an expired license, but one of not licensed yet and have these promotional materials in Tennessee.
That would almost be the same as having a sign at the road, in my opinion. Which, if I'm not mistaken, in this state, you cannot do until your licensure is approved, correct?
I'd like to make a motion that we set the civil penalty for $500, and that's my motion.
I have a motion by Ms. Stevens to change the recommendation to a $500 civil penalty, still authorizing the via consent order informal hearing if necessary. Do we have a second?
I second.
I have a second by Ms. Haynes. Any further questions on number 3? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, number 4.
Next complaint is complaint number 2023-004001. Complainant alleged unprofessional conduct on behalf of Respondent Funeral Director. Specifically, complainant stated that the establishment that Respondent works for completed the celebration of life for the decedent on November 28, 2022, and that following the ceremony, decedent was to be cremated. Complainant alleged that they had spoken to Respondent numerous times regarding the cremation, and that he stated he was waiting on necessary papers to perform the cremation. Complainant stated that as of January 29, 2023, the decedent had yet to be cremated. Respondent replied stating that they had made numerous attempts to have the cremation approval form signed by several doctors. Respondent detailed how, since the decedent did not have a primary care physician, they had reached out to several doctors every week to try and have them sign the cremation approval form. Respondent stated after several doctors and numerous delays, they finally found someone who agreed to sign off on the permit on January 30th, 2023. Respondent stated that the decedent was cremated on February 2nd, 2023, and the cremains were picked up the following day, first by the respondent and then by the family. Respondent stated that they had informed complainant throughout the process that they would not be able to sign the documents themselves since they were not a healthcare professional and they would have to wait on a physician's signature before proceeding. Respondent attached the cremation approval form to show that approval had been granted January 30th, 2023, the cremation permit to show that it had been signed on February 2nd, 2023, and the family accountability form to show that the cremains had been picked up on February 3rd, 2023. Finally, respondent attached communications to show that he had been in contact with the medical examiner's office to try and get the cremation approved as expeditiously as possible. Based on the above, we would recommend closure.
I've got a question, Mr.
Sure.
And maybe just be the wording. 2 months went by, and they said they attempted to get several doctors to approve the cremation paperwork. Are we talking about a permit that the medical examiner, or were they trying to get a death certificate in order to get the permit?
I believe that it is the former. They were trying to get the, from my understanding from the information contained in the complaint and the response, that they were trying to get the approval for cremation.
Do we know what the date of death was here?
I recall it being very shortly before the celebration of life. I should have put that in there, and I did not. But I recall it being late November. I want to say like 25th, 26th, just a couple of days prior to the celebration of life ceremony.
I guess what I keep hanging up on is that if the decedent did not have a physician, period, during the last 4 months, that the medical examiner should have done the death certificate and the cremation permit. And the 2 months just seems just hey.
Do we know, did they stay even in communication with the family out through this process? It almost sounds like maybe they didn't. Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, my understanding is that they did. To what degree, I'm not entirely certain, but I do know that in the respondent's reply, they stated that, I told the family that we're checking in, we're trying to find somebody. I can't sign it myself. I wish I could. and that they, again, to what degree they kept them updated and apprised, I'm not entirely certain, but the respondent did seem to indicate that they had at least communicated. It wasn't just radio silence for 2 months.
I don't foresee that should have taken that long. Medical examiner could have signed it, in my opinion. That's
I mean, the
where I'm
death
struggling.
certificate and the cremation permit all in one thing. I guess that's what I'm missing, I guess.
Yep. For a reason we have closure here instead of letter of warning or even a minimal fine.
I think with the documentation that the respondent provided, particularly of interest when I was looking through everything, was the emails dating back of emailing these people trying to get somebody. It to me, that was evidence that they hadn't just been kind of sitting with it and got a complaint on the 29th of January, and they were like, oh, that's right, I have to do something about it. That's a gap in my knowledge of, I don't know specifically from the professional side what that's like, trying to find someone to sign for it. I don't know if it's complicated. I don't know if it's...
Now, what you said there makes perfect sense. I don't think that they were trying not to do it. I don't think they exactly may have known what action they could have taken to make it more simple. So, but the family does have the cremains now and everything.
When something like this occurs, is the family made aware that there is a decision made from the board not to do anything?
So they are, from my understanding, they're sent a notification letter, essentially, that explains the decision the board ultimately decided to make. It's not phrased in terms of the board decided, not to do something. It's phrased, I think, more in a way that after examining everything, the board decided to resolve this complaint with closure, letter of warning, and then pending a signed consent order. If that's the route it goes, then they're apprised of that as well. They are sent information.
I think our due diligence is to the family to say this is not typical way that funeral directors handle their loved one, and a death that has occurred and something that's not happened in 60 days or 75 days is unacceptable in my opinion. But it is hard for us in our profession to deal with sometimes the medical profession in getting the death certificate signed. I've not ever experienced 2 months, but that may be just a personal thing that's happened in our area. But I know that some funeral homes are having difficulties with medical examiners. But I think that we need to make a statement to the family that we're just not letting this slide by, and that's my opinion. What to do, I don't know, but
as a proposal, if maybe that can kind of reach a middle ground, is maybe Mr. Lee was referencing that there are things you can do to maybe expedite this process or make it simpler. Maybe a letter of instruction so the family feels as if they've been heard and listened to, but also to help maybe instruct and prevent something like this from happening in the future.
I definitely agree with both of you. I don't think it was intentional. I really think it was lack of knowledge and avenues, but I don't want a closure. And what is a letter of instruction compared to a letter of warning? Does that kind of explain to them how that particular system works?
Correct. So letter of warning is disciplinary action, whereas instruction is kind of this is potentially a kind of sticky situation to navigate from a legal perspective. Here's what you can do. And also from a board knowledge perspective, here's what you can do to help navigate the situation in the future.
with a clean disciplinary history, one letter of warning, I'm going to make a motion on this that we issue a letter of instruction to the funeral home in hopes that this will not happen again. And if it does, then this will come up on record for us to know.
Is this up for discussion before, or do you need a second before discussion? So they have in the past had a complaint alleging unethical conduct with a letter of warning. I just hate to see a history of things happening and us allowing things to be easy for our profession. So you've got a motion out there, and
we do have a motion for a letter of instruction from Mr. Lee. Does somebody want to second that?
I'd like to ask Mr. Lee, would you add to your motion a $250 civil penalty? Not call for the vote.
I will amend, because I believe, sadly, if they didn't know what to do, they could have reached out, at least to Nashville or the board or legal or something. So I will amend my motion to a letter of instruction and to a $250 civil penalty.
Second that motion.
All right, we have a amended motion, letter of instruction with a $250 civil penalty by Mr. Lee, excuse me, and a second by Ms. Stevens. Any further questions or discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Number 5.
Next one is complaint number 2022-045291. Complainant's brother of the decedent alleged unprofessional conduct against respondent establishment. Specifically, complainant alleged that he, his mother, the decedent's wife, and some friends arrived at respondent establishment at 9:30 a.m. to view the body of the decedent prior to cremation. Complainant stated that upon entering the crematory, the decedent was in a body bag. After a few moments, the decedent's wife and his friends left, while complainant and their mother remained behind to perform a religious ceremony. Complainant alleges that when they removed the sheet, they saw that the decedent was missing both their left and right arms. Complainant alleged that they had asked an employee what had happened, and complainant claims that the employee only said that the decedent had an autopsy. Complainant stated that they reached out to the medical examiner, who confirmed an autopsy had occurred, but that the decedent was not missing limbs when he arrived and left their facility. Due to the nature of the allegations, this complaint was immediately sent for investigation. The investigator began by conducting a surprise examination of the respondent establishment. The sole purpose of this investigation was to ascertain whether respondent had other decedents in the establishment that were missing limbs, as the decedent in this complaint had already been cremated. The investigator examined first the large walk-in refrigeration unit that had 3 decedents in the unit. All 3 decedents were on shelves and were properly covered, excuse me, and neatly placed. Sorry. The investigator closely examined the 3 decedents and found no missing body parts. An employee informed the investigator that there was also 1 decedent in the smaller 3-drawer refrigeration unit. The investigator examined this decedent and discovered no missing body parts. Next, the investigator met with an apprentice funeral director at the establishment. The apprentice funeral director showed the investigator to the preparation room, which contained 4 decedents. The investigator examined each of the decedents and discovered no missing body parts. Finally, the investigator observed 2 decedents in caskets. The investigator again examined these decedents and found no missing body parts. In total, the inspector had examined 10 different decedents, all of which had all limbs and body parts intact. Approximately a month and a half later, the investigator returned to respondent establishment to conduct another investigation. The investigator again examined 10 total decedents and determined that none of them had missing limbs or body parts. Next, the investigator spoke to the manager of the respondent establishment. The manager stated that he first met with the wife of the decedent on October 19, 2022, and that to their recollection, the wife of the decedent had come to the establishment alone and made all the arrangements for the deceased, and that a direct cremation and memorial service was requested. The manager stated that the wife and other family members arrived on October 21st, 2022 for the memorial service, and that the wife and the family requested to see the decedent before the cremation occurred. The manager obliged and asked employees to escort the family to the crematory facility. The manager stated that the decedent had been autopsied, was not embalmed, and was in a body bag with a sheet placed over the body. The manager stated that according to staff members, the wife had also placed a hat on the decedent and left the crematory to prepare for the memorial service. The manager then stated, according to staff members, the complainant and his mother remained behind to perform a religious ceremony. The manager stated that soon after, the complainant and their mother returned back to the funeral home for the memorial service. And at no time did any family member, including complainant, mention missing limbs on the decedent. Additionally, the manager stated he only became aware of the allegation when he received the complaint. The manager also added that he asked the two staff members who had assisted the family were never asked nor aware of any allegation regarding missing limbs. The manager again reiterated that if there was any issue, he was never made aware of it at any time. Next, the investigator traveled to the medical examiner's office that had conducted the autopsy. After explaining the situation and allegations, the staff member speculated that since the decedent was a larger person, that when complainant viewed the body at the crematory, the decedent's arms may have been hidden on the sides of his body due to his size. The autopsy report confirmed that the decedent was not missing any limbs when he arrived and when he left the facility. Next, the investigator spoke to the wife of the decedent. The wife confirmed that she had made the arrangements herself and that the cremation and a memorial service were scheduled for October 21st, 2022. The wife stated that prior to the cremation, she requested to see her husband to say goodbyes and was accompanied by the complainant, his mother, and a few family members. The wife stated that she viewed her husband, placed a hat on his head, took a photograph, and left the crematory. The wife stated she did not notice any missing body parts. The wife confirmed that the complainant and the mother stayed behind to conduct a religious ceremony, but that they eventually met with the rest of the family in the funeral home for the service. The wife stated that during the service, and even following the service, neither complainant nor the mother had mentioned anything about missing body parts. The wife stated she only became aware of the allegation 3 days later from the complainant. The wife stated she asked why complainant had waited so long to tell her, and complainant stated, quote, they didn't want to upset her, end quote. The wife provided that she could not understand why they had waited so long to inform her, as they could have stopped the cremation to investigate more thoroughly. Finally, the investigator spoke to the complainant, who confirmed that he, his mother, the wife of the decedent, and a few family members saw the decedent prior to the cremation in order to say goodbyes. The complainant explained that he and his mother remained behind to perform a religious ceremony, and the decedent was, quote, laying on a table in a body bag that had been partially unzipped from about the waist area up, end quote. Complainant claimed that while performing the religious ceremony, he pulled the sheet that had been placed on the decedent back and claimed that the decedent's arms were missing. Complainant stated that he informed a staff member about the missing limbs and was told that the decedent had been autopsied. Complainant stated that he did not wish to upset the wife of the decedent anymore, so he did not inform her about the missing limbs. Complainant stated that he did not think to stop the cremation or notify the police at that time. During the course of the second investigation of the respondent establishment, the investigator noted that the crematory operator was not a licensed funeral director. Although the manager, a licensed funeral director, was on the premises in a separate building, the manager was not physically overseeing nor supervising the activity of the unlicensed employee. Based on the above, in tandem with all the information obtained by the investigator, no tangible proof has been discovered or provided to support complainant's allegation other than complainant's testimony. However, respondent establishment has aided and abetted unlicensed activity on behalf of the unlicensed crematory employee. Legal's recommendation would be a $1,000 civil penalty, plus the implementation of a remediation plan for education regarding unlicensed activity, centered around the education of funeral directors and staff, including crematory staff. The educational plan is to include, but not be limited to, 10 hours of continuing education with a minimum of 3 hours on ethics. Respondent must complete the implementation of this plan and provide proof of its implementation to the department within 60 days after the signing of the consent order.
Two questions here. Is the training just for the manager, or do I understand it's got to be for the whole staff?
For the staff.
Okay, and the second question would be, just recently in 2022, they were fined for unlicensed activity at $1,500. So is there a reason why this fine would not be more, considering that?
Yes. So the 1,500 was in tandem. It was unlicensed activity, and I believe some decedents were not very neatly and carefully put away in the refrigeration units. So it got to the 1,500 based on two separate violations. In this instance, since the investigator only witnessed one case of unlicensed activity, we are capped at a $1,000 civil penalty. But again, since that's a recurring factor, or that's a recurring violation, that was the intention of the implementation plan, is to show that, the board is serious about this continuing to occur.
For everything that we have laid before us, there's no proven fact of missing limbs. Is that correct?
Correct.
Other discussion or any other questions?
I'll make a motion to accept legal's recommendation.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Lee to accept legal's recommendation. Do we have a second?
I second.
All right. I have a second by Ms. Haynes. Any further discussion or questions? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Number 6.
This complaint is complaint number 2023-000161. Complainant alleged unprofessional conduct on behalf of respondent. Specifically, complainant stated that the decedent was confirmed to be buried on December 28, 2022 at 11 a.m. Complainant stated that respondent had confirmed both the date and time, and again called to confirm the date and time on December 27, 2022, and informed the family that they should plan to arrive around 10:45 a.m. Complainant stated they arrived at approximately 10:38 a.m. and that respondent had not arrived with the deceased. Complainant stated that at 10:45, respondent has still not arrived. As a result, complainant called respondent and alleged that when speaking to the receptionist stated that the name of the deceased had been put on the schedule but had not assigned a time nor description of service. Complainant alleged that respondent, quote, scrambled to try and secure a driver to bring the deceased to the cemetery. Complainant alleged that the driver, quote, provided no guidance nor sympathy to the family, including upon their 30-minute delayed arrival. End quote. Complainant alleged additionally that on the date of the wake, December 22, 2022, the incorrect name of the deceased was presented in the chapel, floor arrangements were not put out and only brought out upon request, and the guest visitor's signature book was only brought out upon request. Respondent replied stating that the wake service for the decedent was scheduled for 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. and that complainant had arrived prior to the scheduled time. Respondent stated that due to the earlier arrival, the monitors in the main chapel displayed the name of the previous decedent that had occupied the main chapel. Additionally, respondent stated that they informed complainant that they were still in the process of setting up the chapel and that would be a few moments before the setup would be complete. Respondent stated that typically it was standard protocol to do flower arrangement and guest book setup prior to the decedent's loved ones being present, but that complainant had arrived before it was completed. Next, respondent stated that on December 23rd, the anticipated date of the decedent's services, the mayor declared a state of emergency after a severe winter storm caused single-digit temperatures. Respondent stated that due to the storm, several decedents were rescheduled for the following week, and that weather conditions caused delays on the date of the interment. Complainant provided a rebuttal stating that on the day of the wake, they had arrived at approximately 3:02 p.m., and that at the time the floral arrangements were not at the casket until she brought it to the attention of the respondent. Complainant further stated that there was no inclement weather occurrences on the date of the rescheduled date of the burial, December 28, 2022. Complainant alleged that any delays were caused by internal issues of respondent establishment. Complainant further stated that the high temperature on the day of the rescheduled service was 63 degrees and provided an AccuWeather link for the area and day of the interment, which stated the temperature as a high of 63 degrees. Based on the above, we would recommend a $500 civil penalty authorized via consent order and a formal hearing if necessary.
Almost sense a lack of responsibility on the respondent here. I know at our facility, we try to have everything set 2 hours prior, even if you're out on another burial. So to me, I sense a little lack of responsibility here. That's maybe my opinion. I mean, did they say why they were not set and ready?
They didn't. To be honest, most of their response seemed to refer to the rescheduled date. They spoke about the state of emergency with the December 23rd date, and I don't know if they misunderstood what complainant was saying, referring to, we're not talking about the old day, we're talking about the rescheduled day. Really, the only sentence that I saw that could potentially apply to that rescheduled day was that that sentence. Respondent stated that due to this storm, several decedents were rescheduled for the following week, and the weather conditions caused delays on the date of the interment. Whether that is mistakenly applying to the 23rd original day or the rescheduled day, I'm not sure, but they did not elaborate on what potential weather issues may have caused delays on the 27th.
So for future disciplinary history, would this be listed as unprofessional conduct, or is that how
Yes.
it would be listed?
Correct. Unprofessional conduct.
Is there a reason we settled at 500 here?
So I went with 500 in the sense of the allegations regarding the wake are, again, maybe that's a gap in knowledge that I have. It's a little bit of he said, she said. I'm not certain if that was to be taken in the same room, and they did just have previous things from the previous decedent in there. The wake to me was, again, he said, she said. The allegations with the delay on the date of the rescheduled service, I think the respondent says that it was a 30-minute delay. Again, they were the ones to initiate, so if they hadn't called, who knows. I went with recommendation of 500 for the unprofessional conduct violation of that 30-minute delay in the burial. But again, if the board feels a stronger civil penalty is necessary, that's certainly within their purview.
Unless I'm just not reading this right and hearing it right, it's almost like they didn't take apologetic responsibility for not having things ready. Am I wrong in that understanding?
I will say in their response, at the end, they did apologize for the inconvenience that it caused the family. Whether the complainant felt that was communicated to them or not, I'm not certain. They provided a rebuttal, so they did see the response that they made. They did apologize in their complaint, but whether any other apology or thing was made outside of the confines of their formal response, I'm not certain.
Based on their history, they've had $500 penalties, $750 penalties, $1,000 penalties, and I don't know that that's been a learning experience. So I'm going to make a recommendation that that there be a $1,000 civil penalty for unprofessional conduct for this case.
All right, we have a motion by Ms. Stevens to change the recommendation to a $1,000 civil penalty for unprofessional conduct, authorizing via consent order and formal hearing if necessary. Do we have a second?
Based on disciplinary history, it does seem that $500 would probably maybe not get their attention, and it's less than what's been paid in the past. I'll second that.
All right, I have a second by Mr. Lee. Any further discussion or questions? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, number 7.
Next is complaint number 2022-049661. Complainant alleged unprofessional conduct on behalf of respondent. Specifically, complainant alleged that respondent was not responsive while shipping their loved one's remains back to a foreign country. Complainant stated that it was difficult to get in contact with respondent during this process. Respondent did not respond to the complaint. Legal attempted to contact complainant to receive an update regarding their complaint. However, the contact information complainant provided was not complete. Specifically, complainant did not provide the entirety of their phone number. However, given that respondent did not provide a response, respondent has not refuted complainant's allegations. Based on the above, legal would recommend a $1,000 civil penalty for respondent's lack of responsiveness regarding complainant's matter and a $1,000 civil penalty for failing to respond to the complaint. So in total, a $2,000 civil penalty to be authorized via consent order and a formal hearing if necessary.
Still to date, no response, correct?
Correct.
I'll make that short, and I'll make that recommendation. No response to me carries enough weight of its own. So I'll recommend my motion to accept legal's recommendation of a $2,000 civil penalty.
All right, I have a motion by Mr. Lee to accept legal's recommendation, $2,000 civil penalty, authorizing via consent order and formal hearing if necessary. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I have a second by Ms. Haynes. Any further questions or discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Number 8.
I apologize for coughing at all of you this morning.
That's all right.
Take a break and get you a drink.
Hopefully
Yeah.
this will help. Okay. The next complaint is complaint number 2023-000791. This complaint was administratively opened following a routine inspection on January 4th, 2023. During the course of the inspection, it was determined that an employee with the respondent establishment that was employed as a pre-need sales agent had an expired pre-need sales agent registration. Specifically, the employee's registration had expired on November 24th, 2022, and had not been renewed at the time of the inspection. During the period of the employee's expired registration, the employee had written 4 pre-need funeral contracts. On each of these 4 contracts, respondent was listed as the funeral establishment on the contracts. The employee responded on behalf of respondent, apologizing for failing to renew their pre-need sales agent license, stating it was an honest mistake and that as soon as it was pointed out to them, they began the process to renew their registration. The employee admitted that they sold the 4 pre-need contracts, but said they will make every effort in the future to ensure it does not happen again. As the funeral establishment listed on the 4 contracts sold during the employee's unlicensed period, respondent aided and abetted the unlicensed activity. And as a separate note, a complaint has been opened against the employee on the pre-need side. So based on the above, we would recommend a $250 civil penalty to be authorized via consent order and a formal hearing if necessary.
Say, to stay with that consistent, what we've done in the past, having written 4 pre-needs here, is that fine consistent?
It is, yes.
And this is for the funeral establishment, and like I've seen a note here, the employee's going to be dealt with on the burial side.
Correct.
I'll make a motion to accept council's recommendation, $250 civil penalty.
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Mr. Lee, a second by Ms. Stevens to accept legal's recommendation, $250 civil penalty, authorized via consent order and formal hearing if necessary. Any further questions or discussion? All right, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, number 9.
Next complaint is complaint number 2023-003771. This complaint was administratively opened following an inspection conducted on January 17, 2023. The investigator observed that the preparation room was in a, quote, general state of disrepair, end quote. The investigator found a wall with missing sheetrock that allowed outside moisture to enter the room. The investigator stated they also found mold in the prep room from that wall with the missing sheetrock and attached photographs. Additionally, the bathroom in the preparation room did not have access to water, as the commode had water in the bowl but not in the tank. Likewise, the sink had no access to water. Respondent replied, stating that they were not aware of the mold in the prep room until they saw it on the day of the inspection. Respondents said that it had never been like that in all the years prior, and added that they had experienced lots of rain prior to the inspection. Respondents said that at the time of their response, the wall had been resealed with concrete, a paint sealant, and a laminated wall covering. Respondent further stated they were not aware of the water situation. Respondent stated they have since called both a professional to repair the issue and the city water department to fix whatever the issue may have been. Respondent added that it was not the only bathroom, as the public had access to a separate bathroom, and that these bathrooms are clean and well stocked. Respondent provided photographs to show that the wall with mold has been resealed and that future moisture should not be an issue. Based on the above, we would recommend a $500 civil penalty authorized via consent order and a formal hearing if necessary.
How did they operate in their prep room without water?
I am not certain. The respondent didn't address any of those difficulties, just said that they weren't aware of the prep room, bathroom not having water access.
As a funeral director, I am sometimes, when I read these, embarrassed about our profession in some particular cases. But I will make a motion to approve legal's recommendation.
All right, we have a motion by Ms. Stevens to accept legal's recommendation of the $500 civil penalty. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I have a second by Ms. Haynes. Any further questions or discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, number 10.
And the last one is a represent from last month's meeting for complaint numbers 2022-046151 and 2022-048691. These matters were presented to the board at its February 14th, 2023 meeting as follows. Just as a refresher, 2 complaints were opened against respondent alleging identical claims. Complainant alleged that respondent, while an acting manager of a cemetery, had taken funds without the cemetery owner's knowledge by writing himself unauthorized checks and failing to deposit full amounts of sale items. Respondent replied, stating that in June of 2019, the owner and operator of the cemetery announced that they were retiring and asked respondent to assist in the day-to-day activities as they would be moving out of town. Respondent stated it was apparent that they were going to be the primary caretaker of the cemetery after months of handling the cemetery. Respondent stated that in the fall of 2019, after meeting with the owner indicated that the cemetery could start paying respondent for their work with the cemetery. Respondent stated that the owner added respondent to the checking account. It was instructed by the owner to pay everything out of that account. Respondent contends that in July of 2022, respondent, quote, found out there had been a misunderstanding in the amount of compensation between myself and the owner of the cemetery, end quote. After discussing with the owner, respondent stated they withdrew themselves from the daily activities of the cemetery and that respondent repaid the funds to the owner that had been taken out of the cemetery fund. This case was sent for investigation. The investigator spoke first to the cemetery owner, who confirmed that she had spoken with respondent about assisting her with day-to-day operations of the cemetery as she was retiring and moving away. The owner indicated that respondent agreed and that no financial arrangements were made between her and respondent regarding compensation for respondent's work. The owner stated that they had some discussions with respondent that financial compensation could be a possibility in the future, but no formal arrangements had ever been made. The owner added that respondent's name was put on the bank account so that respondent could pay bills for the cemetery. The owner stated that while reviewing the bank statements for the cemetery in July of 2022, she discovered that respondent had been writing himself checks out of the cemetery account. The owner stated that the checks respondent wrote to himself were not authorized and that respondent did not have permission to write himself checks out of the cemetery account. The owner stated after reviewing the bank statements, it appeared that respondent had taken somewhere between $23,000 to $30,000 from the cemetery over roughly 3 years. The owner arranged a meeting with the respondent. During the meeting, the owner contends that respondent apologized for taking the money and that he wanted to make restitution for the money he had taken. On August 9, 2022, the owner met respondent and an additional witness in the parking lot of the funeral home respondent was employed at. The owner received the files related to the cemetery that respondent had in their possession, and that respondent issued a check to the owner for $28,000 for the money that had been taken. The owner accepted this payment and took back control of the day-to-day operations of the cemetery. Next, the investigator spoke to respondent, who reiterated much of what they had said in their response. Respondent again maintained that he and the owner had some discussion that the cemetery could begin paying him for his work with the cemetery, but again stated that no formal agreement or specific amount was ever discussed. Finally, the investigator attempted to contact both complainants. However, the identifying information that was provided, name, email, address, etc., all seemed to be incorrect, as the homes the investigators attempted to visit were either not accessible or were not the homes of the complainants, and the email addresses provided came back as invalid email addresses. So the board asked that we conduct further investigation. As requested, the investigator followed up with the cemetery owner to try and obtain additional information regarding the informal agreement they had with respondent. First, the investigator asked if the owner had any type of formal or informal agreement regarding respondent's payment for work completed at the cemetery. The owner replied that at no time they or the respondent had any type of formal or informal arrangement concerning compensation. The owner did state they had a discussion with respondent about respondent obtaining the cemetery when the owner died or was ready to relinquish ownership of the cemetery, but again reiterated that no formal or informal arrangements were ever made. The owner further provided regarding the missing funds that respondent did make a restitution, but that the repayment occurred only after the owner became aware of the missing money. The owner shared that they had watched the February board meeting and had drafted a letter to address some of the questions that had come up. First and foremost, the owner clarified that they were not one of the anonymous complainants who filed the complaint. The owner stated that while there was no formal agreement in place, when this was brought to respondent's attention, the money was, quote, promptly returned and cemetery records were given back without any question or hesitation, end quote. Additionally, the owner confirmed that they have a friendship with respondent, which led to a fairly informal arrangement, and that the owner had worked alongside the respondent for several years prior to this event. Finally, the owner stated that, in their view, the wrong had been made right and the respondent no longer has access to the cemetery records or financials. Prior to the motion to send this complaint back for further investigation, the board had discussed a 6-month license suspension, 10 hours of continuing education, 5 of which must be in person, with 3 of those 10 in ethics, a $1,000 civil penalty, and plus the costs of investigation. So legal would make a tentative recommendation of picking up there a 6-month license suspension, 10 hours of continuing education, 5 of which must be in person, with 3 of those 10 in ethics, a $1,000 civil penalty, plus the cost of investigation, to be authorized via consent order and a formal hearing if necessary.
A couple things that I'll throw out here on this one. Since I've been on this board, this has come up a couple times. In my book, embezzlement is embezzlement. I don't feel that we ought to change. We ought to stay consistent, which in the past has been a 1-year suspension with the same things that we're laying out here. We've also included that in the past they can't work in funeral business at all during that year. Reading through this, I don't feel that this individual would have ever even come forward had they not been caught, and probably would still be embezzling money. So that's my feelings. Other discussions on it?
I think the difference that I saw, I guess, in the reinvestigation was where the owner stated the same thing that you just did, Mr. Harris, that if it hadn't been brought to their attention, they never would have stepped up. You're saying in the past, the board in this type of situation, pretty much everything's the same except 6 month change to 1 year?
Mr. Bryant, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall one that probably is coming up right now. We did a year suspension with these same layouts, but we also put in there that they couldn't work in funeral business for that year. Am I correct?
Correct. And I think that's originally what legal had in that original recommendation, something similar. It was a 2-year instead of a 1-year suspension. But so I will preface that this recommendation is just going off of the motion, the first motion that had passed prior to a second motion to send it back out for investigation. So that is the reasoning for the recommendation being what it is. But you are correct that typically that has been kind of these similar parameters, a year suspension with an added caveat of not working within the funeral business within that suspension period.
But as we discussed in last month's meeting, that is very difficult to police. But I guess if they were found out that they were working in the industry, then what happens?
In that instance, having signed a consent order, they would be in violation of that consent order. And what would most likely happen is we would administratively open a complaint, and then they would just have another complaint they have to deal with.
We could only regulate what they do in the business as far as being licensed, correct? If their license was suspended, I mean, they could wash cars or do, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know if we could regulate that part of it. Any unlicensed, anything they wouldn't require a license for, cutting grass, washing cars or whatever,
Sure.
we couldn't have a strong hold on that.
Right. At the end of the day, when it comes to a consent order, if the respondent signs it, they've agreed to it. So what has typically been the logic in that recommendation in the past is that, true, you may not be performing licensed activity, but if you're still around a funeral home and there's some issues here, that just puts them in a difficult temptation spot to maybe
Absolutely.
trip up again. And we don't want to see that at all.
I'm going to step out there on this one and change the recommendation to a 1-year license suspension, leave everything else the same, 10 hours continued ed, 5 of which in person, 3 out of these 10 ethics, $1,000 penalty plus the cost of investigation. But I would also like to add that cannot work in the funeral business for the year of suspension. That's my motion.
Second.
All right. I have my motion to change it to a year, second by Ms. Stevens. Any further discussion or questions? All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Mr. Bryant, anything further from you, sir?
That is all I have. And again,
Thank you
Thank
very
you for
much.
your report.
Thank
And
you.
again, I apologize for coughing at the four of you this morning.
You're good. I'm doing it a little myself.
As always, some of the cases we get, you do a great job trying to decipher and lay it all out for us, and I definitely appreciate that. It can't be easy.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Mr. Gribble, we'll hear your executive director's report.
Morning, board member. Thank you, Mr. President. First is a legislative report. This is for today's meeting. It's the same bills that were presented last month. Also, I would mention that some of those bills, at least one of them, has an amendment to it, and maybe on the second amendment. So if you up with those, there's a search right there that you can go to on the General Assembly's website and see some information there as well. You have a report of licenses that have been administratively approved by the Executive Director pursuant to the Board Authority for the period of February 11, 2023 through March 10, 2023. There are no closed establishments we have to report to you today. The disciplinary action reports, a report of consent orders have been administratively accepted and approved by the Executive Director pursuant to the Board Authority and as reported on the January 2023 Regulatory Board Disciplinary Action Report. You have a list of those consent orders have been signed and accepted. And as far as the complaint report, as of March 7, 2023, had a total of 30 complaints, 12 of those against funeral directors and/or embalmers, and 18 against establishments. Mr. President, that concludes my report. I'll be glad to answer questions.
I just have one question, and probably don't know. I wouldn't know. I could find out. But do you have any idea how those bills are progressing? Do they seem to be moving on, or have you heard any roadblocks, or just out of curiosity?
I looked before a day or so before the meeting. The one that seems to have the most movement to it is House Bill 1173 and Senate Bill 1197. That's also the one that has a second amendment to it that they're working on. And I'm not sure about House Bill 1094 and Senate Bill 1114. I'm not sure about that one either, Mr. Lee. I do know that committees are beginning to set closing dates. So if it's not moving, that's kind of what I look at is when I go look at them on the General Assembly's website to see what kind of movement there is. And if you don't see any movement since January or early February, doesn't mean it won't happen this year.
But I've seen it's pretty much in a stalling pattern there.
Yeah, it's kind of
with
like
my experience.
But the ones where you see March hearing dates, and there are some this week that were coming up, I think, in different hearings before long until committees will be down and they won't.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I'll make a motion to accept the Executive Director's report on the record.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Lee, a second by Ms. Haynes to accept Mr. Gribble's Executive Director report. Any further questions for Mr. Gribble? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Any individuals or establishments today, Mr. Gribble?
No establishments, no.
All right. With no individuals or establishment, we will move to new business. Any items to come up in new business? All right. If there are none, we will open the floor for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. I believe we had a tie for Ms. Stevens and Mr. Lee. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. We'll second your motion. So at 11:24, all in favor say aye to adjourn.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
Thank you all for making